Before Eden became a place of rules and reckonings, before it was shaped into a moral landscape of obedience and consequence, there existed older memories, fragile, fragmented, and deliberately forgotten. These were stories not yet disciplined by doctrine, not yet trimmed to fit the straight lines of law. They spoke of a time when order had not fully hardened, when divinity was fluid, and when humanity was still deciding what it meant to belong. In those earliest echoes, creation itself was not quiet, it was unsettled. The world emerged not as a finished design, but as a negotiation between land and sky, between instinct and structure, between freedom and fear. Long before the garden had gates, long before the soil was assigned its hierarchy, there lived a presence that did not bow. Her name in later centuries would be spoken only in fragments. Lilith. She does not arrive in Scripture with ceremony. There is no birth scene, no divine proclamation. Instead, she exists in the margins, in the spaces between verses, in the contradictions that careful editors would later try to smooth away. Lilith is not introduced as a villain. She is not introduced at all. She is remembered. To understand Lilith, one must look backward, beyond Eden, beyond the polished surface of canonical texts, into the sediment of ancient Near Eastern belief. Long before the Hebrew Bible took shape, civilizations across Mesopotamia whispered of female spirits bound not to hearth or home, but to wind and wilderness. In Sumerian and Akkadian myth, figures known as Lilitu moved through the night air, associated with storms, thresholds, and the dangerous hours between dusk and dawn. These beings were not evil by nature. They were untamed, and that distinction would later matter. In early cosmologies, the wilderness was not a place of exile. It was a place of origin. Before cities, before temples, before walls, humanity lived in negotiation with the wild. Survival depended not on domination, but on balance. And in these worlds, power did not always demand submission. Sometimes it demanded awareness. Lilith belongs to that older worldview. She is a memory of femininity before it was disciplined into silence, a reflection of womanhood before obedience became its defining virtue. In the oldest strands of Jewish tradition, preserved not in Scripture but in later commentary, Lilith is described as being formed from the same earth as Adam, not after him, not for him, but with him. This detail, subtle as it is, carries a dangerous weight. To be made from the same dust is to share the same standing, no hierarchy, no ordained imbalance. In a world that would later organize itself around authority and dissent, this equality was not simply inconvenient, it was destabilizing. Stories survive not because they are harmless, but because they serve a purpose. And stories that threaten structure rarely survive unchanged. Before Eden was transformed into a lesson, it was a space of possibility, a mythic memory of a time when humanity had not yet been sorted into roles. Lilith represents that uncertainty. She is not chaos incarnate, but the refusal of a fixed position. She does not kneel, not out of malice, but because kneeling has not yet been defined as sacred. It is only later, when order becomes law, that her presence grows intolerable. As belief systems matured, they did what belief systems often do. They narrowed. Complexity was streamlined. Contradictions were resolved, not by explanation, but by erasure. The garden became a symbol not of coexistence, but of command. Creation was reimagined as hierarchical, God above, man below, woman beneath him. The myth reshaped itself to reflect the architecture of the world it now served. And Lilith no longer fit. She could not be integrated without changing the lesson, so instead she was displaced, removed from the center, pushed outward into the unlit edges of story. What had once been a figure of balance became a problem in need of explanation. In later retellings, her refusal is reframed as rebellion. Her independence becomes disobedience, and disobedience, in a moral universe built on submission, must be punished. But this transformation tells us less about Lilith and far more about the moment she was rewritten. The shift from shared dust to enforced hierarchy mirrors a deeper human transition. As society settled, as agriculture replaced foraging, as cities rose and laws hardened, survival began to depend on predictability. Roles became fixed, authority centralized. The unknown, once a source of wonder, became a threat. In this world, a woman who would not kneel was no longer a possibility. She was a warning. Lilith is the echo of a path not taken, a reminder that the structures we inherit were once choices, that obedience was not always holy, that fear often precedes morality. Her erasure was not sudden, it was careful. She fades, not through condemnation but through omission. Her name disappears from Scripture but lingers in commentary. She survives in footnotes, in folklore, in the quiet anxiety surrounding the night. She becomes a presence felt rather than spoken. This is how uncomfortable truths are buried, not with fire but with silence. Before Eden taught humanity what it meant to fall, there was a version of the story that asked a different question. Not why disobedience leads to suffering, but why obedience became sacred in the first place. Lilith stands at the threshold of that question, unresolved and unsettling. She is not the first demon. She is not the first rebel. She is something older and more fragile, a memory of balance before hierarchy, of identity before rule, of a world where submission was not yet mistaken for virtue. And that is why her story begins not in the garden, but before it, before rules, before obedience, before fear learned how to speak. Chapter 2. Born from the same dust. In the beginning, creation was not yet orderly. It did not unfold as a chain of command, nor did it arrive with instructions etched into stone. The earliest memories of humanity describe a world still unfinished, where meaning had not fully settled and identity had not yet been assigned its boundaries. It is within this unfinished moment that Lilith appears again, not as a deviation, but as an equal. In the oldest traditions, she is not formed in Adam's shadow. She is not shaped later as an afterthought or a companion designed for harmony. She is created alongside him, drawn from the same earth, animated by the same breath, bearing no sign of subordination. The dust that becomes Adam also becomes Lilith. No hierarchy is implied, no division of purpose is declared. They arise from the ground as counterparts, not complements. This detail, preserved quietly in early Jewish commentary, is more than a mythic curiosity. It is a fracture in the narrative that would later define Western belief. For if both are made from the same soil, then neither is meant to rule. And if neither is meant to rule, the structure of authority itself begins without a foundation. Equality in these early stories is not celebrated. It is unresolved. The ancient world did not yet possess the language to sanctify balance. Survival demanded coordination, not ideals. As communities grew and permanence replaced movement, order became a necessity rather than a convenience. Hierarchies emerged not because they were righteous, but because they were efficient. And once efficiency hardens into tradition, it begins to call itself truth. In this transformation, equality becomes unstable. A world built on shared origin offers no clear command, no natural justification for dominance, no divine explanation for obedience. And so equality, once a simple fact of creation, slowly transforms into a problem in need of correction. Lilith embodies that problem. She does not accept a position beneath Adam because none has been defined. In the oldest retellings, her resistance is not violent or theatrical. It is quiet. She insists on sameness, on shared ground, on equal dust. And in a system preparing to elevate order above balance, this insistence becomes intolerable. To understand why, one must look beyond myth and into anthropology. Early human societies, especially those transitioning from nomadic to settled life, experienced profound anxiety around control, over land, over reproduction, over lineage. Stability required predictability, and predictability required structure. Gender roles, once fluid, became rigid. Power needed clear direction, and ambiguity became dangerous. In such a world, a woman who claimed equal footing threatened more than domestic order. She threatened inheritance, authority, and continuity. Her very existence questioned who was meant to lead and why. Lilith's equality did not fail because it was wrong. It failed because it could not be managed. As religious traditions evolved, creation stories were refined to reflect the societies that told them. Myths are never static. They adapt, selectively remembering what supports the present and reshaping what does not. In later canonical texts, a second creation appears, one more precise, more hierarchical. Woman is no longer formed from the same dust, but from man himself, bone of bone, flesh of flesh, not equal in origin, but derivative. This revision does not erase Lilith directly, it renders her unnecessary. The first woman becomes easier to govern when she is made from man rather than beside him. Equality is replaced with intimacy, hierarchy softened by affection, obedience reframed as harmony. The problem is solved, not by confrontation, but by rewriting the beginning. Lilith, however, remains. She survives in the negative space between these stories, a reminder that another version once existed, one where equality was not yet feared, but simply unresolved. Her presence exposes the tension between myth and power, between what may have been imagined and what was required to endure. In refusing hierarchy, Lilith does not reject creation. She rejects correction. She stands as a testament to the idea that imbalance was not inevitable, that it was chosen. And like many choices made for survival, it later demanded justification. Over time, the narrative adjusts. Lilith's insistence on equality is recast as arrogance. Her unwillingness to submit becomes defiance, and defiance, in a moral system now centered on obedience, becomes sin. The problem is no longer structural, it is personal, no longer societal, it is her fault. This shift is subtle but devastating. By turning equality into rebellion, belief systems protect themselves from scrutiny. The question is no longer why hierarchy exists, but why Lilith refused it. Responsibility moves away from the structure and onto the individual. And once the individual is blamed, exclusion becomes righteous. Lilith is not punished for being evil, she is punished for being unmanageable. Her story reveals a recurring pattern in human belief. When balance cannot be controlled, it is declared dangerous. When equality disrupts order, it is labeled unnatural. And when power needs legitimacy, myth is shaped to provide it. Yet the memory of shared dust persists. It lingers because it speaks to something deeply human, a quiet recognition that inequality is learned, not born. That hierarchy is constructed, not divine. That beneath layers of law and belief, we all rise from the same ground. Lilith reminds us of this truth, not through triumph, but through loss. She is what disappears when systems choose certainty over balance. What is sacrificed when order becomes sacred. Her erasure is not accidental. It is necessary for the story that follows. And so, before Eden becomes a lesson, before obedience becomes virtue, there exists a moment, brief and unresolved, where two beings stand on equal ground, formed from the same earth, bound by no rank, answerable to no hierarchy. It is a moment history could not hold, and Lilith carries it with her into exile. Chapter 3. The Refusal. There are moments in myth where the world does not break with violence, but with a word left unsaid. Not a scream, not a strike, just a refusal. In the story of Lilith, this is the moment everything turns, not through betrayal, not through temptation, but through a quiet, immovable no. In the oldest echoes of the tradition, Lilith does not seek to overthrow creation. She does not conspire against divinity, nor does she attempt to corrupt what has been made. Her act is far simpler and far more dangerous. She refuses to submit. This refusal is not dramatic. It is not fueled by rage or ambition. It is rooted in origin. Lilith remembers the dust. She remembers that it was shared, and because she remembers, she will not kneel. In a world still forming its rules, this should not have been a crime. But the world was changing. Creation was no longer fluid. It was beginning to harden into order. And order, once imagined, demands enforcement. Submission becomes the language of stability. As human society shifted toward permanence, toward land ownership, lineage, and inherited power, dominance became more than practical. It became moral. To submit was to be good. To obey was to belong. And to refuse was to fracture the fragile illusion that the world could be controlled. Lilith's refusal does not challenge Adam alone. It challenges the structure forming around them. It exposes a truth the system cannot survive, that authority, at its root, is not natural. It is negotiated. And negotiations can be declined. In later retellings, this moment is sharpened, moralized, simplified. Lilith is accused of insubordination, of pride, of rebellion. But these are retroactive judgments. They belong to a later world, a world that has already decided the outcome and now needs a justification. At the moment of refusal, there is no sin, only incompatibility. Lilith will not accept position beneath Adam because the position itself has no precedent. It is being invented in real time, and invention, when resisted, often responds with punishment. Anthropologically, this moment reflects a recurring fracture in human history. When societies transition from egalitarian structures to hierarchical ones, resistance does not disappear. It is redefined. What was once difference becomes defiance. What was once autonomy becomes threat. Lilith is not feared because she disobeys. She is feared because she proves obedience is optional. This is an unbearable revelation for any system built on dominance. As order asserts itself, it reframes the narrative. The refusal is no longer contextual. It is personal. Lilith is no longer incompatible with hierarchy. She is hostile to it. And hostility, once named, can be exiled. In later mystical texts, Lilith's refusal is bound to language itself. She speaks the unspeakable name of God and leaves. This detail is telling. Knowledge and autonomy intertwine. To know the name is to claim agency. To speak it without permission is to step outside assigned limits. Power does not forgive this easily. The world responds the only way systems know how to respond to defiance, by redefining it as evil. But beneath the accusation lies fear, a deep unspoken anxiety that if one refuses, others might follow. That submission, once questioned, may never fully recover its sanctity. Lilith's refusal threatens contagion. This is why the reaction must be absolute. She cannot remain. She cannot be debated. She must be removed from the story's center and relocated to its margins. The wilderness awaits, not as punishment alone, but as containment. The untamed is where the unmanageable are sent. Yet even in exile, the refusal does not disappear. It lingers, unresolved, a question without an answer. What if submission was never inevitable? What if hierarchy required enforcement precisely because it was not natural? What if the world chose dominance, not because it was divinely ordained, but because it was easier to control? Lilith carries these questions with her into the dark. Over time, the refusal becomes distorted. It is retold by those who benefit from order. Its edges are sharpened, its meaning inverted. Lilith is said to abandon her place, to choose chaos over harmony, to value self above creation. But this is projection. Harmony, in these later tellings, no longer means balance. It means compliance. Peace becomes synonymous with silence. Stability becomes indistinguishable from submission, and any refusal, no matter how grounded in origin, is recast as destruction. This transformation mirrors a pattern seen again and again throughout history. When empires rise, dissent becomes treason. When doctrines solidify, doubt becomes heresy. And when power seeks permanence, refusal becomes unforgivable. Lilith's crime is not that she refuses Adam. It is that she refuses inevitability. She exposes the scaffolding behind authority. She reveals that what presents itself as divine order may, in fact, be a human arrangement, fragile, recent, and deeply afraid of collapse. For this, she must be othered. In the centuries that follow, Lilith's refusal is mythologized into monstrosity. Her autonomy is reimagined as seduction, her independence as corruption. The refusal itself is buried beneath layers of accusation until the original act is barely visible. But it is still there. You can sense it in the discomfort surrounding her name, in the way later traditions warn against her influence, in the insistence that she must be controlled, warded off, invoked only through protection rituals. These are not responses to evil, they are responses to memory. Lilith remembers a moment the world is trying to forget. A moment when order had not yet declared itself sacred, when dominance still required explanation, when refusal was possible without damnation. That moment could not last. The story moves on. Hierarchy asserts itself. Eden becomes structured. Obedience becomes virtue. And Lilith becomes the first to be cast out, not because she destroyed the world, but because she revealed its fault lines. Her refusal marks the beginning of a long tradition, the punishment of those who will not comply with narratives written for them, the transformation of dissent into danger, the rewriting of memory to protect power. And yet, the refusal endures. It survives not in scripture, but in unease, in the quiet recognition that submission is learned, that authority depends on acceptance, and that somewhere beneath our inherited beliefs there is still a voice that remembers the dust. Lilith does not kneel. Chapter 4. Exile into the night. Exile rarely arrives as thunder. More often it comes as a quiet decision, an absence where presence once stood. Lilith is not struck down. She is not destroyed. She is removed. And in that removal, something ancient begins to change shape. Cast from the garden, Lilith does not disappear from the world. She disappears from permission. The garden by now has become more than a place. It is an idea, contained, ordered, illuminated. It represents a world where every being has a role, every action a consequence, every hierarchy a justification. To belong within it is to accept its rules. To remain is to comply. Lilith does not. And so she is sent beyond its borders. The exile marks a critical turn, not only in her story, but in the architecture of belief itself. What cannot be controlled is no longer debated. It is relocated. The garden closes in on itself, and everything unresolved is pushed outward into the dark. The wilderness awaits. In ancient thought, the wilderness is not merely geography. It is psychology. It is the realm beyond law, beyond protection, beyond certainty. It is where boundaries dissolve and identities blur. For early civilizations, the wild represented everything that resisted containment: storms, disease, death, and desire. It was feared not because it was evil, but because it could not be mastered. Lilith's banishment places her precisely there. She becomes aligned not with destruction, but with the unknown, and in human history, the unknown is rarely allowed to remain neutral for long. As societies grow more rigid, they require clear distinctions, sacred and profane, pure and impure, inside and outside. The wilderness becomes the opposite of order, a mirror held up to civilization's anxieties. It is where contradictions are sent to fade. But Lilith does not fade. In exile she transforms. Stripped of belonging, she is reimagined. Her independence, once merely incompatible, begins to feel threatening from a distance. What was refusal becomes defiance. What was autonomy becomes predation. The story adjusts to protect itself. This is the moment independence is rebranded as danger. In later folklore, Lilith's presence is said to haunt the night. She moves through desolate places, through ruins and windswept edges. She becomes associated with thresholds, doors, windows, borders, places where inside and outside meet. These are not arbitrary details. Thresholds are sites of vulnerability, moments of transition. And Lilith, now untethered, becomes a symbol of what crosses boundaries without permission. Anthropologically, this transformation follows a familiar pattern. Throughout history, those who live outside sanctioned structures, nomads, outcasts, heretics, are often mythologized as threats. Their difference is magnified, their motives questioned. Over time, distance turns misunderstanding into fear. Lilith's exile allows society to project its anxieties onto her. She becomes a canvas for everything the garden refuses to acknowledge within itself. Sexuality ungoverned, power without oversight, knowledge without approval. The wilderness absorbs these fears and gives them form. But it also gives Lilith space. Outside the garden's narrative, she is no longer bound by its definitions. She is not wife, nor subject, nor failure. She exists beyond classification. And for systems built on order, this is the most unsettling state of all. To exist without a role is to threaten the roles of others. As her story moves further from its origin, Lilith is increasingly described not as exiled, but as choosing exile. This subtle shift is significant. Choice implies intention. Intention implies guilt. The system absolves itself by suggesting she wanted the dark. But exile is rarely chosen freely. It is accepted when the alternative is erasure. In the wilderness, Lilith becomes associated with night, not because darkness is evil, but because it conceals what daylight demands to categorize. Night dissolves hierarchies. It blurs outlines. It equalizes vision. In darkness, the garden's structures lose their authority. This is why the night must be feared. As Lilith's legend deepens, the wilderness itself begins to change meaning. No longer a neutral space, it becomes hostile, predatory, cursed. The dangers of nature are moralized. Survival becomes righteousness. Safety becomes proof of obedience. And everything beyond the garden becomes suspect. Yet, even as fear grows, Lilith's presence persists. She appears in protective charms, whispered warnings, ritual invocations. Parents speak her name not to honor her, but to guard against her. These practices reveal a contradiction. She is feared, yet acknowledged, condemned, yet remembered. This is not the treatment of something forgotten. It is the treatment of something unresolved. Lilith's exile marks the moment when society decides it cannot destroy what challenges it, so it transforms it into a warning. Independence becomes monstrous, not because it causes harm, but because it undermines control. The wilderness becomes her domain because it is the only place left for what cannot be domesticated. Over time, the boundary between Lilith and the wild dissolves. She is said to move like the wind, to dwell in desolation, to appear where human presence thins. This mythic geography mirrors a psychological one. Lilith occupies the spaces people avoid, not because they are empty, but because they are uncontrollable. Civilization defines itself by what it excludes. The garden's survival depends on this exclusion. Its order is preserved by contrast. Inside is safe, outside is dangerous, and Lilith, now fully outside, becomes the embodiment of that danger. But danger is not the same as evil. In many ancient traditions, the wilderness is also a place of revelation. Prophets retreat there. Visions are born there. Transformation occurs away from the center, not within it. The margins are where the old self dissolves and something else takes shape. Lilith's transformation follows this pattern. Exile does not weaken her. It strips away the need for acceptance. Freed from the demand to conform, she becomes something the garden cannot contain, a reminder that order is not the only way the world can exist. This is why she must be feared. Not because she attacks the garden, but because she proves life continues without it. Lilith's banishment marks a turning point in mythic memory. From this moment on, independence is no longer neutral, it is suspect. Autonomy becomes a risk, the unknown becomes hostile by definition. And yet, the wilderness remains. It surrounds the garden, it presses against its borders, it waits beyond the walls, and Lilith remains within it, not erased, not destroyed, but transformed into a symbol of everything society refuses to reconcile within itself. She is the cost of order, the echo of a choice made long ago to sanctify dominance and exile balance, to illuminate one path and darken all others. Lilith walks into the night not as a defeated figure, but as a consequence, a reminder that what we cast out does not vanish. It waits, and in the dark, it remembers. Chapter 5, The First Demonization. Demonization does not begin with horns or shadows. It begins with language, with a story retold just enough times to feel inevitable. What cannot be controlled is rarely destroyed outright. It is reinterpreted, reshaped, until fear replaces memory. Lilith's transformation into a demon is not sudden, it is deliberate. In the earliest traces of her story, she is simply incompatible, a presence that refuses alignment. But incompatibility is difficult to condemn on its own. It raises questions, and questions, when allowed to linger, threaten authority. So the narrative shifts. Her autonomy is no longer neutral. It becomes suspect. And suspicion, when repeated, hardens into judgment. What was once refusal is renamed rebellion. This is the first step. As religious traditions solidify, the language surrounding Lilith darkens. She is no longer merely outside the garden. She becomes opposed to it. Her independence is no longer a condition. It is a motive. And motives, once assigned, invite moral consequence. The woman who would not kneel is now said to corrupt those who do. In later Jewish texts, particularly medieval mystical traditions, Lilith is recast as a nocturnal threat. She is blamed for infant death, for seduction, for misfortune in the night. These associations are not arbitrary. They reflect the deepest fears of settled societies: vulnerability, sexuality, and loss beyond explanation. What cannot be predicted must be blamed. Anthropologically, this pattern is familiar. When a society cannot integrate a figure or idea into its moral framework, it assigns that figure the role of antagonist. Complexity is flattened, nuance erased. The story becomes easier to teach, easier to remember, easier to fear. Lilith becomes a vessel for this simplification. Her autonomy, once rooted in shared origin, is reframed as corruption. The suggestion is subtle but powerful. Freedom is dangerous. Equality is destabilizing. And independence, especially when embodied, must be restrained or destroyed. But restraint alone is not enough. To justify exclusion, the narrative must go further. Lilith must be made monstrous. In this process, her femininity becomes central. The traits that once marked her as equal, agency, desire, self-definition, are reimagined as predatory. Sexuality is no longer a shared human experience. It becomes a weapon. Knowledge is no longer neutral. It becomes temptation. This transformation mirrors broader historical anxieties around female autonomy. Across cultures, women who exist outside sanctioned role, widows, healers, midwives, mystics, are often recast as dangerous. Their independence disrupts inheritance, lineage, and control. Demonization becomes a tool to enforce boundaries. Lilith is among the earliest figures to bear this burden. Her name begins to appear in incantations, not as a memory, but as a threat to be warded off. Amulets are worn, rituals performed, words spoken to keep her at bay. These practices reveal an uneasy truth. Belief systems do not demonize what they consider powerless. Fear follows significance. By assigning Lilith a demonic role, the culture that fears her also acknowledges her influence. She is no longer a forgotten figure. She is actively remembered, though only in distorted form. This is how control is maintained, by ensuring that remembrance is inseparable from dread. The demonization of Lilith also serves another function. It absolves the system of responsibility. If Lilith is evil by nature, then her exile was justified. Her suffering becomes deserved. The story protects itself by placing blame on the one who refused. But demonization is never neutral. It reshapes not only how a figure is seen, but how a society understands itself. By turning Lilith into a demon, the narrative draws a clear moral boundary. Inside the garden is goodness, order, safety. Outside is danger, corruption, chaos. The complexity of human choice is replaced with binary certainty. Yet the need for this certainty betrays insecurity. If obedience were truly sacred, refusal would not need to be feared. If hierarchy were truly divine, equality would not need to be demonized. Lilith's transformation reveals the fragility of the structures that reject her. Over time, her image grows more elaborate: wings, talons, shadows. But these additions obscure rather than explain. They distract from the original tension, the unresolved question of why her autonomy was intolerable in the first place. Demonization is not about truth. It is about containment. By making Lilith monstrous, the narrative ensures that no one seeks to emulate her. Fear replaces curiosity. Warning replaces memory. The lesson becomes clear. To step outside assigned roles is to invite annihilation. And yet, even as her image darkens, something of the original story remains visible beneath the layers. The demon still carries traces of the woman. The monster still speaks of a refusal. The corruption still points back to freedom. This persistence is what unsettles the myth. Lilith cannot be fully erased because she embodies a tension that has never been resolved, the tension between control and autonomy, between order and balance. Her demonization is an attempt to settle that tension by force. But force does not dissolve memory. It only drives it underground. In the centuries that follow, Lilith's name continues to circulate, whispered, warned against, invoked in fear. These repetitions keep her alive, even as they seek to contain her. She becomes a shadow cast by the very systems that reject her. The first demonization is not the end of Lilith's story. It is the beginning of its distortion. A moment when a woman is no longer allowed to exist as herself and must be transformed into something less human so that her challenge can be dismissed rather than confronted. What could not be controlled had to be rewritten. And in that rewriting, a demon was born, not from evil but from fear. Fear of equality. Fear of autonomy. Fear of a world that might exist without permission. Chapter 6. Mother of Monsters. Monsters are rarely born. They are assigned. Over centuries, Lilith's name gathers weight, not from truth but from repetition. Each generation adds another accusation, another fear, another impossible role. She becomes a thief of children, a seductress in the night, a destroyer of men. And with each new burden, her humanity recedes further into shadow. This transformation does not reveal who Lilith was. It reveals who we were afraid to be. In the medieval imagination, the night was not empty. It was crowded with danger, illness that struck without warning, infants who failed to wake, desires that escaped moral restraint. Science had not yet learned to speak, medicine had few answers, and fear left without explanation turned toward myth. Lilith became its vessel. When infants died in their sleep, when childbirth ended in grief, when the fragile promise of lineage was broken, societies needed a cause that could be named. The loss was too painful to accept as random, too devastating to remain unanswered, and so the blame was externalized, given form, given intent. Lilith becomes the child stealer. This accusation carries deep psychological weight. Children represent continuity, inheritance, the future made flesh. To lose them is to confront the fragility of survival itself. By assigning this loss to Lilith, fear is given direction, grief is shaped into warning, and the world regains a sense, however false, of order. Amulets are hung near cradles, incantations whispered over newborns, not to honor Lilith, but to keep her away. These rituals are acts of desperation, not superstition. They are attempts to reclaim control in a world that offers none. The monster is easier to face than the void. But Lilith's burden does not end there. As cultures tighten their control over sexuality, her image shifts again. She becomes the seductress, the one who tempts men away from righteousness, who appears in dreams, who embodies desire without permission. This transformation reflects a growing anxiety that desire itself cannot be fully governed. In patriarchal societies, uncontrolled sexuality threatens lineage, inheritance, and authority. Desire must be disciplined, regulated, sanctified within boundaries, and any expression outside those boundaries must be condemned. Lilith becomes the embodiment of that threat. Her sexuality is no longer mutual, it is predatory. Her presence no longer chosen, it is imposed. She is blamed not for desire itself, but for its disruption, for revealing that attraction does not always obey law. This pattern repeats across cultures and centuries. Women who exist outside sanctioned roles, who are unmarried, independent, knowledgeable, are often sexualized and demonized simultaneously. Their autonomy is reframed as manipulation, their presence as temptation. Lilith carries this contradiction fully. She is feared for her independence and then blamed for the consequences of that fear. She becomes the destroyer of men, not because she harms them, but because she exposes their vulnerability to desire. The responsibility shifts, control is preserved, and yet the story continues to grow darker. In some traditions, Lilith is said to give birth to monsters, legions of demons, endless offspring spawned from chaos. This imagery is telling. It reflects a fear not just of individual rebellion, but of contagion, of influence spreading, of refusal multiplying. To call her the mother of monsters is to suggest that dissent reproduces. This is a powerful anxiety in any hierarchical system. That one act of defiance may inspire others. That autonomy, once witnessed, cannot be unseen. By casting Lilith as generative evil, the myth warns against imitation. Her independence is no longer singular, it is infectious. But this fear reveals its own weakness. If obedience were truly natural, it would not require such elaborate cautionary tales. If hierarchy were divinely stable, it would not tremble at the idea of one woman refusing to submit. Lilith's monstrous motherhood is not a reflection of her actions. It is a reflection of the culture's need to isolate rebellion and ensure it appears unnatural. As centuries pass, these roles accumulate: child killer, seductress, demon queen. Each layer moves further from the original story. The woman formed from shared dust disappears beneath the weight of accusation. What remains is a symbol so distorted it barely resembles its origin. And yet, beneath the exaggeration, the pattern remains consistent. Lilith is always blamed for what cannot be controlled: infant mortality, sexual desire, loss of authority, fear of the unknown. These are not her crimes. They are human anxieties. Anthropology teaches us that myths often function as mirrors. They reflect the tensions, fears, and unresolved contradictions of the societies that tell them. In this sense, Lilith is not the mother of monsters. She is the archive of cultural dread. Each role assigned to her corresponds to a moment of insecurity. When survival feels uncertain, she becomes lethal. When desire feels dangerous, she becomes seductive. When order feels threatened, she becomes generative chaos. The monster adapts because fear does. What is striking is that Lilith is never portrayed as random. Her actions are always purposeful. She is given intent, malice, desire. This intentionality allows societies to moralize suffering, to believe that pain happens for a reason, that loss is not arbitrary but deserved, or at least explainable. This belief is comforting, but it comes at a cost. By placing the blame on Lilith, cultures avoid confronting their own limitations, their lack of medical knowledge, their inability to protect children, their struggle to reconcile desire with control. The monster absorbs responsibility so the system can remain intact. Lilith becomes a scapegoat, not for sin, but for uncertainty. And like all scapegoats, she must be burdened beyond reason. The impossibility of her roles is precisely the point. No single being could embody so many fears, but myth does not require plausibility. It requires resonance. And Lilith resonates because she carries everything that frightens us about ourselves. She is not feared because she is monstrous. She is monstrous because she is feared. In this way, the title, Mother of Monsters, becomes deeply ironic. The true monsters are not born from Lilith, but from the narratives constructed around her, from the need to externalize fear rather than face it, from the refusal to accept uncertainty as part of being human. Lilith's story shows us how easily memory can be twisted when power demands it, how a figure of autonomy becomes a symbol of destruction, how independence is recast as danger and fear is given a face. Yet, even now, the weight placed upon her does not erase the original truth. She is still remembered, not as she was, but as she was needed to be. And in that distortion, we glimpse something essential. The monsters we create say far more about us than about those we name. Lilith does not give birth to monsters. She inherits them. Chapter 7. Fear Made Feminine. Fear does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it reshapes itself into symbol, into story, into a figure that carries what a culture cannot openly name. In the case of Lilith, fear takes a distinctly feminine form. By this point in her mythic journey, Lilith is no longer simply exiled or demonized. She has become something more abstract and more enduring, a vessel, a container into which societies pour their deepest unease, not fear of destruction, but fear of disruption, not fear of death, but fear of what refuses to remain in its place. Lilith is not feared because she ends the world. She is feared because she does not belong to it. Across centuries, the qualities attributed to her follow a clear pattern: sexuality without permission, knowledge without restraint, power without sanction. Each of these represents a boundary crossed. Each threatens a structure built on regulation and control. And each, when embodied by a woman, becomes intolerable. In patriarchal systems, femininity is often defined not by what it is, but by what it must contain. Desire must be channeled, knowledge must be limited, power must be mediated. When these constraints are violated, fear emerges, not as reasoned opposition, but as moral panic. Lilith embodies that panic. Her sexuality is not framed as relational or nurturing, but as autonomous. It does not serve lineage, inheritance, or social order. It exists for itself. This alone is enough to provoke dread. Desire that answers only to itself cannot be governed, and what cannot be governed must be condemned. Thus, sexuality becomes dangerous when it is no longer obedient. Similarly, Lilith's association with forbidden knowledge marks another rupture. In later traditions, she is linked to secret names, hidden wisdom, and arcane understanding. Knowledge in hierarchical societies is power, and power, when held outside sanctioned channels, becomes a threat. Lilith knows too much. and does not ask permission to know it. This too must be punished. But perhaps most unsettling of all is her power. Not power derived from title or blessing, but power that exists independently of approval. Lilith does not rule. She does not command armies. She does not sit on thrones, and yet she is feared as if she does. Why? Because her power is not granted. It is inherent. She does not need validation to exist, and in systems built on sanction and authority, this is the most destabilizing condition imaginable. Power without permission undermines the very logic of hierarchy. Anthropologically, this pattern repeats with striking consistency. Cultures often project their anxieties onto figures who exist outside normative roles: women who do not marry, women who speak publicly, women who heal without license, women who refuse containment. They become witches, temptresses, demons. Not because they are destructive, but because they are uncontained. Lilith's myth becomes a map of this projection. Every fear that cannot be resolved within the system is relocated onto her. She becomes the explanation for discomfort that has no acceptable source. Why does desire resist control? Why does knowledge escape boundaries? Why does power appear where it should not? Lilith answers these questions, not by resolving them, but by absorbing them. In doing so, she allows the system to remain intact. The fear is no longer structural, it is personal, no longer embedded in the rules themselves, but in the one who violates them. Responsibility shifts away from the order and onto the outsider. This is the function of making fear feminine. By gendering danger, societies naturalize inequality. They suggest that instability arises not from rigid systems, but from unruly bodies. That chaos is not a result of oppression, but of resistance. That the problem is not control, but those who refuse it. Lilith's refusal to belong becomes her defining trait. She does not fit into roles of wife, mother, or subordinate. She does not anchor herself to home or lineage. She moves through spaces without asking to be claimed by them. And for a world that equates belonging with virtue, this is unforgivable. Belonging becomes morality. To refuse belonging is to invite suspicion. Thus, Lilith is not merely excluded, she is pathologized. Her independence is no longer a choice, it is a symptom. Her autonomy is no longer intentional, it is unnatural. The narrative reframes her existence as a deviation from what is proper. This reframing allows fear to masquerade as righteousness. Yet, beneath this moral language lies something far more fragile: insecurity. If belonging were truly fulfilling, refusal would not be threatening. If roles were truly just, stepping outside them would not inspire dread. Lilith's myth exposes the anxiety beneath enforced order, the fear that compliance is not chosen freely, but compelled. Her refusal reveals that belonging, as defined by the system, may come at the cost of self. This is why she must be feared, not because she destroys, but because she demonstrates another way of existing, one that does not depend on approval, one that does not seek inclusion at any cost, one that accepts exile rather than erasure. Fear gathers around this possibility. Over time, Lilith's image becomes increasingly abstract. She is less a character and more a concept, a symbol invoked to warn, to restrain, to discipline. Parents caution against her, texts condemn her, rituals guard against her influence. These practices are not aimed at her alone. They are aimed at anyone who might resemble her. Lilith becomes a boundary marker, a mythic signal of where acceptance ends. Her story teaches not through example, but through exclusion. It instructs by showing what happens when one doesn't belong. And yet, the persistence of her myth suggests something else. Fear does not cling to what is irrelevant. It clings to what unsettles. Lilith remains because the anxieties she carries have never been resolved. Sexuality still resists regulation. Knowledge still escapes control. Power still emerges where it is not sanctioned, and those who embody these forces are still treated with suspicion. Lilith endures because she names a truth societies struggle to face, that fear often arises not from harm, but from freedom. She is not feared because she destroys the world. She is feared because she refuses to be shaped by it. In making fear feminine, cultures attempt to localize danger, to give it a body, a name, a warning. But fear does not stay contained. It leaks back into the system, haunting its margins, whispering its doubts. Lilith walks those margins still, not as a destroyer, but as a reminder that belonging is not the same as virtue, that refusal is not the same as evil, and that fear, when left unexamined, will always seek a body to inhabit. For centuries, that body has been hers, and in fearing her, we have revealed ourselves. Chapter 8. Erased from Scripture. Erasure is rarely loud. It does not arrive with fire or decree. More often, it arrives quietly, through omission, through absence, through a silence so carefully maintained that over time it begins to feel natural. Lilith is not defeated in Scripture. She is removed from it. As religious traditions mature, they do not merely preserve belief, they refine it. Stories are gathered, sorted, sanctioned. Contradictions are resolved, ambiguities trimmed away. What remains is not simply sacred history, but a carefully constructed moral architecture, one designed to endure. And in this architecture, Lilith no longer has a place. The canon hardens. Texts that once circulated fluidly, told, retold, reshaped, are fixed. Authority settles not only on interpretation, but on inclusion itself. What is written becomes truth. What is excluded becomes dangerous. And what lingers outside the official record is treated with suspicion. Lilith slips into that outer darkness. She does not vanish entirely. Instead, she survives where sanctioned belief rarely looks, in commentary, in marginal notes, in whispered explanations for verses that no longer quite align. She appears in the spaces scholars feel compelled to explain but cannot safely affirm. This survival is fragile, conditional. In rabbinic literature, Lilith is mentioned cautiously, often indirectly. Her name surfaces in discussions meant to resolve textual tension. Why does Genesis seem to describe creation twice? Why does woman appear to be formed in two different ways? Lilith becomes an answer, but never the answer. She is allowed to exist only as explanation, not as truth. This is how uncomfortable ideas are managed. Forbidden texts take her further. In mystical traditions like the Kabbalah, Lilith's story deepens, darkens, grows more elaborate. Here, she is no longer merely an early woman. She becomes a cosmic force, a partner to chaos, a reflection of imbalance. But these texts themselves exist on the margins, studied in secret, approached with caution. Knowledge of Lilith becomes restricted knowledge, and restriction signals fear. Anthropologically, canonization is as much about power as belief. To define what is sacred is to define who speaks with authority. To control Scripture is to control memory. When a figure challenges the moral framework a canon is meant to protect, exclusion becomes the safest option. Lilith is not removed because she lacks significance. She is removed because she has too much. Her story introduces unresolved questions about equality and autonomy, refusal that Scripture is no longer willing to entertain. These questions threaten cohesion, and cohesion, once established, must be defended. So Lilith is silenced. But silence is not absence. It is presence under restraint. Her name is spoken cautiously, if at all. Her role diminished, her origins obscured. She is transformed from a figure of meaning into a footnote of fear, and footnotes are easy to ignore. Yet the silence surrounding her is not empty. It is deliberate. Every omission tells a story. Every absence marks a choice. The decision not to include Lilith in canonical Scripture reflects a broader impulse to remove narratives that complicate obedience, that suggest alternatives, that remind humanity the world might have been organized differently. The hardened canon does not tolerate ambiguity. And Lilith is ambiguity incarnate. By pushing her into commentary rather than scripture, tradition maintains control over her interpretation. She can be warned against without being honored, feared without being legitimized, remembered without being empowered. This strategy preserves the moral clarity the canon seeks to project. But clarity comes at a cost. The absence of Lilith creates a vacuum, a missing voice in the story of origins, a silence where another perspective once existed, and silence, like exile, has consequences. What is not spoken does not cease to influence. It simply moves elsewhere. Lilith migrates into folklore. Here, freed from theological constraint, her story adapts. She becomes local, intimate, personal. Parents warn children about her. Communities whisper her name to explain misfortune. Protective rituals persist long after belief systems claim to have moved beyond them. Folklore remembers what Scripture excludes. This persistence reveals a tension between official belief and lived experience. Doctrine may deny Lilith's place in sacred history, but fear continues to invoke her. Loss continues to require explanation. Desire continues to resist regulation. And where Scripture offers silence, folklore offers story. Lilith becomes the voice of what cannot be canonized. Her survival in forbidden texts and folk tradition suggests that her erasure was never complete. It was strategic, a containment rather than a destruction. She is allowed to exist, just not where she might shape doctrine. This is the nature of intentional silence. It does not eliminate the idea, it limits its reach. Over time, this silence begins to feel authoritative. New generations inherit a scripture without Lilith and assume she was never meant to be there. Her absence becomes proof of her illegitimacy. The story forgets that forgetting was a choice. And yet, cracks remain. Scholars notice inconsistencies. Mystics explore what lies beneath the surface. Artists and storytellers return to the margins and find her waiting. Lilith's silence invites curiosity, and curiosity, once awakened, is difficult to suppress. The very act of erasure gives her power, because silence invites interpretation. Lilith becomes a symbol not only of refusal, but of memory lost by design. Her absence reminds us that history, sacred or otherwise, is never neutral. It is shaped by those who hold the pen, and what they choose not to write can be as influential as what they include. In erasing Lilith from Scripture, tradition attempts to stabilize meaning, to narrow the story of creation, to ensure that origins point unambiguously toward obedience. But origins are rarely that simple. Lilith's silence speaks of an older complexity, a time when multiple possibilities coexisted, when creation had not yet been streamlined into doctrine, when equality, autonomy, and refusal had not yet been declared incompatible with order. Her erasure marks the moment when ambiguity becomes dangerous. And so the silence persists, maintained by repetition, reinforced by authority, passed down as absence rather than argument. Lilith becomes something Scripture does not say, and in that unsaying her challenge is preserved. Because silence does not destroy memory. It preserves it in fragments, in commentary, in folklore, in forbidden texts, and in the quiet unease that arises whenever origins feel incomplete. Lilith remains there, just beyond the sanctioned page, unwritten yet remembered, excluded yet influential. A reminder that what is erased from Scripture is not always what was untrue, but what was inconvenient. Her absence is intentional, and intention leaves traces. If one listens closely to the margins, to the silences, to the questions that never quite go away, Lilith can still be heard, not proclaiming, not accusing, but waiting, in the space where the story was narrowed. Chapter 9. Echoes in Folklore. When belief hardens into doctrine, It narrows its vision. What does not fit is set aside. But folklore does not obey the same rules. It has no canon to protect, no authority to satisfy. It moves quietly through kitchens and bedrooms, through lullabies and warnings, through the ordinary language of fear and care. And it is here, beyond the reach of official belief, that Lilith survives. Though erased from Scripture, she is never truly forgotten. Her name lingers in whispers. Folklore remembers what doctrine tries to forget, not because it seeks rebellion, but because it preserves experience. Where Scripture speaks in ideals, folklore speaks in consequence. It records what people felt, what they feared, what they could not explain. And Lilith, burdened with centuries of anxiety, finds fertile ground there. In night stories told to children, she returns as a warning, not always named, sometimes only implied, a presence that comes after dark, that watches from the threshold, that must be kept away with care and caution. Parents hang charms near cradles. They speak protective words before sleep. These practices are not acts of belief in doctrine. They are acts of memory shaped by loss. Long after theology dismisses her, folk traditions continue to invoke her name, not as goddess, not as equal, but as explanation. When misfortune strikes without cause, when infants fail to wake, when dreams disturb the mind, Lilith becomes the language fear knows how to speak. This persistence is not accidental. Folklore thrives where certainty fails. It fills the gaps left by silence. And the silence surrounding Lilith only deepens her presence. Her exclusion from Scripture creates a vacuum, one that lived experience rushes to fill. Across regions and centuries, her image shifts again. In some traditions, she is warded off with red thread. In others, her name is written and erased, spoken and concealed. These rituals vary in form but share a common impulse: acknowledgement without reverence, recognition without acceptance. Lilith is feared, but she is also expected. This expectation reveals a quiet contradiction at the heart of belief. Official doctrine may deny her place in creation, but everyday life continues to make room for her. The sacred text may be silent, but the household is not. The canon may exclude her, but the night remembers. Folklore does not ask whether Lilith should exist. It assumes she does. Anthropologically, this pattern reflects a broader truth about how cultures transmit memory. Formal institutions preserve ideology. Informal traditions preserve emotion. When the two diverge, folklore becomes the keeper of what ideology cannot fully erase. Lilith becomes an inheritance passed not through Scripture, but through caution, through the way parents speak softly at night, through the charms tied near doorways, through the stories told when the world feels unsafe. These are not tales of rebellion in the grand sense. They are acts of survival, quiet negotiations with uncertainty, and in them, Lilith is not merely a demon. She is a reminder that the world is not fully ordered, no matter how strongly doctrine insists otherwise. Her presence in folklore also carries a subtle defiance. By remembering Lilith, communities preserve an alternative memory of origins, one not sanctioned, not approved, but persistent, a memory that resists total control. In this way, folklore becomes a quiet rebellion, not against faith, but against forgetting. Lilith's name crosses generations, not because it is celebrated, but because it is useful. It gives shape to fear. It provides a narrative where none exists, and narratives, even dark ones, are preferable to silence. Yet over time, something else begins to happen. As her story is retold, it softens in places. Some versions portray her not as purely malevolent, but as tragic, lonely, exiled. Others depict her as powerful but distant, more force than figure. Folklore, unlike doctrine, allows for contradiction. It does not need Lilith to be consistent, only resonant. In this flexibility, fragments of her earlier identity survive. the woman who would not submit, the figure cast out for refusing hierarchy, the presence beyond control. These aspects surface subtly, woven into the cautionary tales. Lilith is feared not only for what she does, but for what she represents. She moves freely. She exists without belonging. She answers to no authority. And that, even centuries later, remains unsettling. Folklore carries this unease forward, embedding it in everyday practice. It ensures that Lilith is never fully dismissed as fiction. She remains close, near beds, doors, dreams, always at the threshold. Thresholds are important. They mark transitions between day and night, inside and outside, safety and danger. Lilith's association with these spaces is no coincidence. She inhabits the in-between, where certainty falters and rules blur. Folklore thrives there too, in the spaces doctrine cannot fully illuminate. This shared territory allows Lilith to endure. While official belief insists on clarity, folklore accepts ambiguity. While Scripture seeks resolution, folklore preserves tension. And Lilith, unresolved and unsettling, belongs more to the latter than the former. Her continued presence challenges the authority of erasure. It suggests that forgetting is not as simple as exclusion, that stories removed from sacred texts may still shape the lives of those who never read them. That memory survives not only in books, but in behavior, in how people act when no one is watching, in how they protect what they love, in how they explain what they cannot control. Lilith's folklore existence is not loud. It does not demand recognition. It waits, passed from mouth to ear, from generation to generation, each retelling slightly altered, yet unmistakably hers. This quiet endurance is perhaps her greatest transformation. No longer central, yet never gone. No longer named in doctrine, yet invoked in practice. Lilith becomes a shadow memory, one that moves alongside official belief, neither confronting nor obeying it. A reminder that culture is never wholly governed by authority. That beneath sanctioned narratives there runs an undercurrent of lived experience, and that this undercurrent remembers differently. Folklore does not ask permission to remember. It carries what matters. In this way, Lilith's persistence becomes a form of resistance, not the dramatic refusal of earlier chapters, but a quieter one. The refusal to let silence have the final word, the refusal to allow erasure to become truth. Her name, carried softly across centuries, becomes an echo of an older story, one that doctrine could not absorb but could not destroy. Lilith survives not as doctrine, not as scripture, but as presence. In the dark, in the margins, in the stories told when certainty fades. And as long as folklore lives, as long as humans seek meaning in the night, Lilith will remain, not reclaimed, not forgiven, but remembered. A quiet rebellion whispered through time. Chapter 10. The Psychology of the Outcast. Every society, no matter how refined its laws or sacred its stories, carries an unspoken fear that order is fragile, that beneath the rituals, the hierarchies, the rules that promise stability, something restless waits to surface. When that fear grows too large to confront directly, it is rarely examined. Instead, it is given a shape. Lilith becomes that shape. By the time her story reaches this stage, she is no longer only a figure of myth. She has become a psychological instrument, a way for societies to see their own anxieties without recognizing them as such. She reflects a pattern that repeats across cultures and centuries. Dissent transformed into monstrosity, difference recast as danger, refusal rewritten as corruption. This is not unique to Lilith. It is human. When a belief system defines itself by unity and obedience, dissent threatens more than rules. It threatens identity. To question the structure is to suggest it is not inevitable. And that suggestion, left unchecked, can unravel everything built upon it. So dissent must be managed. One way is punishment, another is exile. But the most enduring method is transformation. The dissenter is not argued with, they are redefined. Their motives are darkened, their humanity obscured, until opposition no longer appears rational, but pathological. Lilith's evolution follows this logic precisely. She begins as incompatible, then defiant, then dangerous, and finally monstrous. Each stage distances her further from empathy until fear replaces understanding. The system no longer needs to explain itself because the outcast has been made unrecognizable. This process reveals something essential about the psychology of power. Societies do not externalize fear because they are cruel. They do it because fear is destabilizing, uncertainty corrodes authority, doubt weakens cohesion. And so, fear is relocated, placed onto a figure who can carry it without threatening the center. Lilith becomes that carrier. By attributing danger to her, society absolves itself of introspection. The problem is no longer structural, it is personal, no longer embedded in the rules, but embodied by the one who breaks them. This is the psychology of the outcast. Across history, this pattern appears again and again. Those who challenge dominant narratives are often described not as wrong, but as unnatural. Heretics become demons, rebels become beasts, outsiders become monsters. Not because they destroy society, but because they reveal its vulnerabilities. Lilith's refusal exposes a fragile truth. Obedience requires belief, and belief can be withdrawn. Once that possibility is acknowledged, authority must respond swiftly, not with reason, but with fear. Fear works faster. By making Lilith terrifying, the system discourages identification. No one wants to see themselves reflected in a monster. Empathy dissolves. Curiosity fades. The lesson becomes clear. To dissent is not to differ. It is to become something other. This psychological mechanism protects the collective self-image. The society remains good. Order remains sacred. And fear is safely contained within the outcast. But containment is never complete. Lilith's monstrosity carries traces of what was rejected: autonomy, knowledge, power without permission. These qualities do not disappear when demonized. They persist beneath the surface, unresolved. And because they persist, the outcast must remain visible, feared, warned against, invoked. A monster forgotten is a danger uncontrolled. So Lilith remains present, not as herself, but as symbol. A constant reminder of what happens when one steps outside the sanctioned story. Her image warns without words. It disciplines without force. Psychologically, this is efficient. But it is also revealing. If dissent truly posed no threat, it would not need to be monstrous. If refusal were meaningless, it would not require mythic punishment. Lilith's transformation suggests that what she represents continues to trouble the imagination. She becomes a mirror, not reflecting who she is, but reflecting what society cannot face within itself: the desire for freedom, the discomfort with imposed roles, the awareness that hierarchy is constructed, not ordained. These realizations are unsettling. They introduce complexity where simplicity is demanded, and complexity, when unmanaged, can fracture collective belief. So fear is externalized. Lilith is feared so the system does not have to fear itself. This process also reveals how morality is often shaped less by ethics than by anxiety. Actions are judged not by their consequences, but by how they threaten stability. Lilith is condemned not because she harms others, but because she disrupts order. Her crime is symbolic. She shows that the rules are not natural laws, but agreements, and agreements can be renegotiated. In response, the narrative hardens. Her image grows darker, her intentions more malicious. The monster must be convincing. It must feel inevitable. Otherwise, doubt creeps back in. And doubt is contagious. The psychology of the outcast also explains why Lilith is never redeemed within traditional frameworks. Redemption would require acknowledgement. It would suggest that the system might have been wrong, that exile was unnecessary, that fear, not justice, drove the transformation. Such admissions are rare. Instead, the outcast remains frozen in their monstrous role, serving as a permanent boundary marker. Lilith's story teaches not through dialogue but through exclusion. It instructs by showing what lies beyond acceptance. This has a chilling effect. Over time, individuals internalize the lesson. They learn not only whom to fear, but what parts of themselves must be suppressed. Desire, doubt, ambition, independence, these traits associated with the outcast become suspect within the self. The monster moves inward. In this way, Lilith's demonization shapes psychology as much as myth. She becomes a cautionary figure not only in stories, but in identity formation. Her presence polices behavior long after belief in her literal existence fades. This is the quiet power of myth. It does not need to be believed to be effective. It only needs to resonate. Lilith resonates because she embodies a tension that has never been resolved, the conflict between belonging and authenticity, between safety and freedom, between order and selfhood. By casting her as a monster, societies avoid confronting that conflict directly. They displace it. But displacement does not heal tension. It preserves it. And so the outcast must remain. Lilith survives because the fears she carries are still alive. The fear that obedience is fragile, the fear that authority depends on compliance, the fear that, without control, the world might not collapse, but change. This fear is older than Scripture, older than doctrine, older than the garden itself. Lilith becomes its face. A face shaped by projection, by anxiety, by the need to see danger outside rather than within. She is not the origin of fear. She is its reflection. And in that reflection, if we look closely, we do not see a demon staring back. We see ourselves as a society afraid of dissent, afraid of complexity, afraid of the possibility that order, once questioned, may never feel certain again. Lilith stands at the edge of that fear, not as its cause, but as its consequence. The outcast we created, the mirror we cannot break, and the reminder that monsters are often born not from evil, but from what we refuse to understand. Chapter 11. From Goddess to Warning. There is a particular kind of loss that does not come from destruction, but from diminishment. A loss where something vast is not shattered, but reduced, where divinity is not denied outright, but slowly stripped of meaning until only a warning remains. This is what happens to Lilith. In the oldest shadows of her story, there are traces of something more than mortal, a presence aligned with wind and night, with thresholds and beginnings. In ancient Near Eastern myth, female figures associated with these forces were not inherently evil. They were powerful, ambiguous, capable of creation and destruction alike. Divinity in these early worlds was not gentle. It was complex. Lilith may once have belonged to this landscape, not as a benevolent goddess nor as a demon, but as something older and less defined, a figure who embodied independence, liminality, and selfhood before those qualities required justification, before morality narrowed the world into permitted and forbidden. But as belief systems evolved, complexity became a liability. Divinity began to change shape. Gods were no longer fluid forces of nature, but enforcers of order. The sacred became aligned with hierarchy. Power was no longer something that moved freely. It was something that sanctioned obedience. And in this new religious architecture, Lilith could not remain divine. She was too unresolved. Rather than being destroyed, she was reframed. Her divinity was not denied. It was inverted. What once may have been sacred autonomy became transgression. What once may have been cosmic independence became rebellion against order. The goddess becomes a warning. This transformation reveals a deeper shift, not only in myth, but in social imagination. As religious narratives hardened, so too did the boundaries of acceptable womanhood. The sacred feminine was no longer expansive, it was contained. No longer autonomous, it was relational. Womanhood became defined not by power, but by alignment with order. Lilith represents what had to be excluded for this definition to hold. Her reduction into a cautionary figure serves a clear purpose. She becomes an example, a story told not to understand her but to prevent imitation. Her fall is instructive. It teaches that stepping beyond assigned roles leads not to freedom, but to exile. That autonomy invites punishment. That challenging order results in erasure. This is not merely mythic storytelling. It is social instruction. Throughout history, myths have functioned as quiet teachers. They shape expectations, define boundaries, and reinforce norms without the need for force. Lilith's story becomes one such lesson, directed not only at women, but at the idea of resistance itself. Her warning is gendered, but its reach is broad. Yet the narrowing of acceptable womanhood is central to her transformation. Where earlier traditions allowed women to occupy roles of mystery, power, and spiritual authority, later systems demanded predictability. Womanhood became synonymous with nurture, obedience, and containment. Anything beyond that was suspect. Lilith embodies everything that exceeded those limits. She is sexual, without permission, powerful, without mediation, independent, without justification. And because of this, she becomes dangerous, not because she causes harm, but because she destabilizes expectations. Her fall charts the shrinking space allowed for women within sacred narratives, from divine force to demonic threat, from autonomous being to cautionary tale. Each step reflects a tightening grip on what womanhood was allowed to mean. The warning becomes clear. Power without submission is unacceptable. Over time, this lesson becomes deeply internalized. Lilith is no longer discussed as a figure with her own story, but as a symbol of consequence. Her identity dissolves into moral function. She exists not to be understood, but to be avoided. This is the final stage of reduction. Once possibly divine, she is now didactic. And didactic figures are never allowed complexity. Her suffering becomes irrelevant, her motivations ignored. The narrative no longer asks why she challenged order, only that she did. The warning does not require empathy, it requires clarity. Good versus bad, order versus chaos. Yet beneath this clarity lies fear. The need to reduce Lilith into a warning suggests that her challenge was never fully resolved. If autonomy were truly incompatible with order, it would not need to be cautioned against so persistently. The repetition of her fall implies anxiety that others might recognize themselves in her story, that they might ask the same questions. Why must power be sanctioned? Why must belonging require submission? Why must womanhood be defined by limits rather than possibility? By turning Lilith into a warning, the narrative attempts to close these questions. It does not answer them. It silences them. But silencing does not erase tension. It preserves it beneath the surface. Lilith's fall also reveals how morality is often constructed retrospectively. Order is treated as sacred not because it is inherently just, but because it has prevailed. Those who challenge it are judged by the outcome of their challenge, not by its merit. Lilith loses, and therefore she is wrong. This logic echoes throughout history. The defeated are remembered as threats. The excluded are remembered as dangers. And the boundaries of acceptable identity are drawn around those who survive within the system. In this way, Lilith's transformation from goddess to warning is not unique. It is archetypal. She joins a long lineage of figures whose complexity is flattened to protect power, whose stories are simplified to discourage questioning, whose fall is used to justify the limits imposed on others. Yet even as a warning, Lilith retains a strange potency. Warnings endure because they speak to something real. They persist because they address fears that have not disappeared. Lilith continues to unsettle because the tension she embodies, the conflict between autonomy and order, remains unresolved. Her fall traces not the triumph of morality, but the narrowing of imagination. A world once capable of imagining divine independence becomes one that fears it. A myth once open-ended becomes prescriptive. Possibility gives way to prohibition. And womanhood, once expansive, becomes conditional. Lilith's story reveals the cost of this narrowing. What is lost when autonomy is feared rather than explored? What disappears when complexity is reduced to warning? What remains unspoken when divinity is allowed only within obedience? She becomes a symbol not only of consequence, but of exclusion. Excluded from divinity. Excluded from belonging. Excluded from acceptable womanhood. Yet exclusion is not the same as irrelevance. Lilith's warning continues to echo because the boundaries it enforces are still contested. The questions she raises are still asked, sometimes quietly, sometimes defiantly. And each time those questions surface, her story stirs again, not as a goddess, not as a demon, but as a reminder of what was once possible and what was lost when order demanded certainty over balance. Lilith's fall does not end her influence. It defines it. She becomes the shape of a warning carved into myth, a lesson etched into cultural memory, a trace of an older world where divinity was not synonymous with control and womanhood was not measured by obedience. And in that trace, something still lingers. A sense that the warning was never about destruction, but about fear. Fear of a power that does not ask to belong. Fear of a woman who cannot be contained. Fear of remembering that the boundaries of acceptable womanhood were not always so narrow. And did. Chapter 12. The Return of the Forgotten. There are stories that never truly end. They wait. They retreat into the margins when the world is not ready for them, when language becomes too rigid and belief too narrow to hold their meaning. They survive in fragments, in echoes, in silence. And when the conditions change, when new questions are asked and old certainties begin to weaken, they return. Lilith returns this way. In modern times, her name rises again, not from scripture or doctrine, but from curiosity, from dissatisfaction, from a growing awareness that something vital was missing from the stories we inherited. She does not reemerge as a demon to be feared, nor as a goddess to be worshipped, but as a symbol, layered, contested, and alive. This return is not accidental. It unfolds in moments of cultural reckoning, when societies begin to examine the foundations of their beliefs, when power structures are questioned, when voices long excluded demand recognition. In these moments, forgotten figures surface, not because they were wrong, but because they were unfinished. Lilith is one of them. Scholars revisit the texts that once confined her to footnotes. They trace her origins through ancient myth, through rabbinic commentary, through folklore and mysticism. What they find is not a singular character, but a palimpsest, a figure written over repeatedly, each layer reflecting the anxieties of its time. In peeling back these layers, Lilith becomes legible again. Not as monster, not as warning, but as memory. A memory of autonomy that predates obedience, of equality imagined before hierarchy became sacred, of refusal not as evil, but as agency. This reframing does not deny the darkness of her myth. It contextualizes it. It asks not what Lilith did, but why her story was altered so drastically. Artists take up this question visually and poetically. In paintings, novels, music, and film, Lilith is no longer confined to the night as a predator. She appears contemplative, defiant, wounded, whole. She is depicted standing alone, not as threat, but as presence. These interpretations do not seek to sanitize her, they seek to restore complexity. Lilith becomes a language for experiences that have long lacked one, for those who live outside prescribed roles, for those who are told they are too much, too independent, too knowing, too unwilling to comply. In her, they find a figure who was never allowed to belong, and yet refused to disappear. This reclamation is not about nostalgia. It is about resistance. To reclaim Lilith is to challenge the mechanisms of erasure that shaped her story. It is to ask why certain narratives are preserved while others are buried. Why autonomy is so often reframed as danger. Why memory itself can be treated as subversive. Lilith becomes a symbol not because she offers answers, but because she holds questions open. Seekers turn to her not for doctrine, but for resonance. In spiritual movements outside traditional frameworks, Lilith appears as an emblem of self-definition. She represents the right to exist without permission, to define oneself without sanction, to step beyond imposed boundaries and accept the cost. This is not a gentle symbol. It carries the weight of exile, of demonization, of centuries of fear. To reclaim Lilith is not to ignore her suffering, but to acknowledge it, and refuse to let it define her entirely. Her return also reflects a broader psychological shift. Modern societies are increasingly aware of how myths shape identity, how stories told repeatedly become internalized, how warnings become limits, and limits become self-policing. In re-examining Lilith, there is an effort to confront these inherited narratives, to see how fear was woven into morality, how control disguised itself as order. Lilith offers a way to interrogate that inheritance. She stands at the intersection of myth and psychology, asking uncomfortable questions. Why is refusal so threatening? Why is independence so often punished? Why are certain voices silenced rather than debated? In reclaiming her, scholars and artists do not claim Lilith as a flawless icon. They resist turning her into another simplification. Instead, they allow her contradictions to remain. She can be fierce and wounded, liberating and unsettling, empowering and unresolved. This refusal to simplify is itself an act of resistance, because simplification was always the tool used to erase her. The modern Lilith does not demand belief. She demands attention. She asks us to look at what was lost when her story was narrowed, at what was excluded to preserve order, at what voices were silenced to maintain certainty. Her return also challenges the idea that progress means forgetting the past. Instead, it suggests that progress may require retrieval, that healing may involve remembering what was deliberately obscured. Lilith's resurfacing reveals how memory functions over time. Stories suppressed do not vanish, they adapt. They wait for conditions that allow them to be heard differently. And when they return, they often speak to the very tensions that caused their suppression in the first place. Autonomy, belonging, power, identity. These are not ancient concerns, they are immediate. And Lilith's story resonates because it addresses them without resolution. She does not offer a blueprint, she offers a mirror. In this sense, Lilith becomes less a character and more a question mark in cultural memory, a reminder that the past is not fixed, that interpretation is ongoing, that meaning evolves as we do. Her return also exposes the fragility of erasure. For centuries, institutions worked to silence her, to push her into margins, to define her as something to be feared or ignored. And yet she persists, not because she was preserved, but because she was needed. Needed as a counter-narrative. Needed as a symbol of refusal. Needed as a reminder that history is shaped as much by exclusion as by inclusion. Lilith's modern resurgence does not undo her exile. It acknowledges it. It recognizes that her power lies not in reclaiming a lost throne, but in illuminating the processes that removed her in the first place. She returns, carrying the memory of that removal. In doing so, she becomes an emblem of resistance against erasure, not only of women, but of all figures who were deemed inconvenient to dominant narratives. Her story aligns with countless others whose voices were silenced to maintain coherence, whose complexity was flattened to protect power. To remember Lilith is to resist that flattening. It is to insist that stories can be revisited, that meanings can be reopened, that what was once forbidden can be examined without fear. Her return does not seek to replace old myths with new dogmas. It invites reflection. It encourages listening to the margins. It reminds us that what we inherit is not neutral, and that forgetting is often a choice. Lilith stands again at the threshold, not outside the garden this time, but outside the story as it was told. She looks back, not in anger, but in recognition. She knows what was taken from her, and she knows what was taken from us when she was erased. Her modern form is not a demon in the night. It is a presence in thought, a question carried forward, a symbol reclaimed not to dominate the narrative, but to complicate it. Lilith returns not because the world has finally accepted her. She returns because the world has finally begun to ask why it feared her. And in that question, something long forgotten stirs back to life. Chapter 13. What Lilith Still Asks Us. Some stories survive not because they are comforting, but because they are unfinished. Lilith's story endures for this reason, not because it offers closure, not because it resolves into virtue or punishment, but because it leaves behind a question, quiet, unsettling, and persistent, that no civilization has ever fully answered. Who decides which voices are sacred, and which must be cast into the dark? Lilith's journey, traced across myth, scripture, folklore, and silence, reveals a pattern older than any single belief system. Again and again, societies elevate certain voices while burying others. Again and again, authority declares itself sacred, while dissent is framed as dangerous. And again, those pushed into the margins are told their exclusion is natural, necessary, even righteous. Lilith stands at the center of this process, not as its cause, but as its witness. Her story was never only about autonomy or rebellion. It was about permission, about who is allowed to speak, to define, to exist without sanction. When Lilith refused to submit, she did more than challenge a rule. She challenged the authority that assigns rules in the first place. And that challenge still echoes. Every culture draws lines between acceptable and forbidden, between truth and heresy, between voices worth preserving and voices best forgotten. These lines are rarely neutral. They are drawn by power, maintained by repetition, and defended by fear. Lilith exposes this mechanism by standing outside it. She does not ask to be canonized. She does not demand to be redeemed. She simply exists as a reminder that the sacred is not discovered, it is decided. And decisions, once made, carry consequences. Those consequences are written into myth. Lilith is cast out not because she destroys order, but because she questions who defines it. Her exile reveals a truth that unsettles every system of belief, that sanctity often follows authority, not morality. That voices become sacred not because they are just, but because they are permitted. And what is not permitted must be silenced. Yet silence does not erase presence. It only displaces it. Lilith's banishment teaches us how societies manage what they cannot reconcile. First, they redefine it, then they marginalize it, then they demonize it. Finally, they erase it while insisting the erasure was inevitable. But the persistence of Lilith's story suggests otherwise. If her voice were truly irrelevant, it would not need to be suppressed. If her questions were meaningless, they would not linger. The very effort to cast her into the dark reveals how deeply threatening those questions remain. Because Lilith asks something fundamental. Who gets to speak, and not who speaks loudest, not who speaks longest, but who is allowed to speak at all? This question extends far beyond myth. It reaches into law, into religion, into culture, into memory itself. It shapes whose stories are told as history and whose are dismissed as legend, whose suffering is documented and whose is mythologized, whose voice becomes doctrine and whose becomes folklore. Lilith's story reminds us that exclusion often wears the mask of order, that silence is rarely accidental, and that sacredness is frequently bestowed, not earned. Her endurance challenges the idea that belief systems are purely spiritual constructions. It reveals their psychological and political dimensions, the ways they protect themselves by narrowing discourse, by sanctifying obedience, by framing resistance as threat. Lilith does not ask us to abandon belief. She asks us to examine it, to ask why certain stories were preserved while others were buried, to notice how fear shapes morality, to recognize that casting something into the dark does not make it disappear. It gives us another form. Throughout history, those forms repeat. Women who speak beyond permitted boundaries, thinkers who question sacred assumptions, communities whose experiences do not fit official narratives. They are often treated as Lilith was, not debated but excluded, not understood but warned against. Their voices survive not in institutions but in whispers, art, memory, and resistance. Lilith becomes their ancestor, not as a symbol of perfection, but as a symbol of refusal to be erased quietly. What makes Lilith enduring is not that she offers answers, but that she keeps the question alive. She reminds us that the line between sacred and profane is drawn by human hands, that what is cast into darkness may be feared, but it may also be true, and that truth, when suppressed, does not vanish. It waits. Lilith's story also asks us to consider our own relationship to belonging, to ask where we have learned to silence ourselves, where we have internalized warnings disguised as wisdom, where we have accepted limits not because they were just, but because they were enforced. In this way, her story turns inward. The demon becomes a mirror. What parts of ourselves have we been taught to fear? What questions have we learned not to ask? What voices, within and without, have we accepted as unworthy of sanctity? Lilith does not demand that we reclaim her as goddess or absolve her of darkness. She asks something far more difficult, that we recognize how easily darkness is assigned, how quickly difference becomes danger, how often silence is mistaken for absence. Her story endures because every generation redraws the boundary between belonging and exile. And each time that boundary is drawn, the same question returns, quiet, persistent, unresolved. Who decides? Who decides which voices define the sacred? Who decides which stories become law? Who decides which memories deserve preservation and which must be buried beneath fear? Lilith stands at the edge of that decision, not pleading, not condemning, simply present, a reminder that the dark is not always where evil lives. Sometimes it is where inconvenient truths are placed, where unresolved questions are stored, where voices denied legitimacy continue to speak softly across time. Lilith's story does not end with redemption or damnation. It ends with recognition. Recognition that belief is shaped by power, that memory is shaped by choice, and that silence is rarely neutral. She asks us to listen, not only to what has been sanctified, but to what has been excluded, to hear the echoes beneath doctrine, to notice the stories that survive without permission. Because what we cast into the dark does not disappear. It becomes folklore. It becomes symbol. It becomes question. And questions, once asked, are difficult to silence. Lilith remains not because she demands belief, but because she demands awareness. She lingers as a test of how we understand authority, voice, and belonging. In the end, her story is not a warning about disobedience. It is a warning about erasure, a reminder that the sacred is never fixed, that voices once silenced can return, and that the darkest places in our stories are often not where monsters dwell, but where truths were placed when we were not ready to hear them. Lilith still asks us, who decides? And what happens to the voices that answer without permission?